Breaking news, friends! October 4th and the military airfields in Crimea, Kacha and Belbek are on fire right now. Explosions. No. There's something going on there.
There's an airfield there. Damn.
I was a bit worried. Most of the tactical aviation has been withdrawn from the area, according to public sources. What's burning here in the center? We're preparing for the deoccupation of the peninsula, according to Sky News. That's the goal of the military operations. Drones attacked the Azot plant in the Perm region and the Orsk Oil Refinery in the Orenburg region of Russia. Ukraine may be supplied with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles. And with this aid, not only frontline targets, but also key military objectives deep inside Russia are now within reach. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, get ready for truly large-scale blackouts, fuel shortages, and a harsh winter for the Russians. The cockles have struck. There's no power here at all. At the same time, attacked oil refineries have already knocked out more than 40% of Russia's oil processing capacity, with losses estimated at $100 billion. Yeah, they totally screwed their fucking oil. Russia is essentially experiencing an energy and fuel crisis. Let's discuss the details with the well-known military analyst Roman Sviatan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with occupied Crimea. First of all, regarding the information from Sky News that the armed forces of Ukraine are preparing brilliant special operations to deoccupy the peninsula. This article came out today, I read it. And right away, military airfields in Crimea are burning. Kacha and Belbek have been hit. They're writing about it at length, and drones are also at work. What do you say?
Regarding the deoccupation of Crimea, we ourselves have been saying for several years that the most optimal option for us is to deoccupy, to start the deoccupation of our territory precisely with Crimea. Crimea is an operational geographic cauldron squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. The entry and exit are under our control. If the Kerch Bridge is destroyed, then basically the only way to get into Crimea would be by sea, which is very problematic, or via land crossings that are completely under our control. Within a range of about 100 kilometers, we can reach them from both sides. We have the means to reach them. In other words, Crimea itself is practically begging to be deoccupied. And what's most interesting is that this can be done without ground operations, without naval operations, including without an amphibious landing and without losses. We can deoccupy it, destroy, expel, and drive out the Russian troops. That is what deoccupation means. With long-range strike capabilities, as long as we have them in sufficient quantity, the main component here is aviation, which is being used in this millennium to carry out combat missions. It is precisely this that will allow us to drive out the Russian troops, to destroy them depending on their willingness to die, so to speak. Because for several years now, we've been telling the Russians that they need to learn how to leave Crimea, whether by swimming, crawling, or dog paddling. It's been, about 3 years we've been talking about this, but it's definitely the 4th year now. So now we have this opportunity, and our special services are taking action to eliminate the enemy's command. This indicates that preparations are underway for a serious cover attack. And it's roughly the kind that doesn't involve politics. It's purely a technical matter. Just like Mossad, or rather the Israeli IDF struck Iran. Again, I'm saying without geopolitics, purely as a technical operation. They cleared out the Iranian air defense, and after that, from 1,000 kilometers away, while for us it's only 300, at 1,000 kilometers, their aircraft had to refuel. We don't need to refuel. Their aircraft entered Iranian territory, just as we can enter the airspace over Crimea and use free-falling precision-guided bombs and guided missiles to take out ground targets. Just as it was done, for example, against Iranian military targets after entering their airspace 1,000 kilometers from the airbase. So it's basically a one-to-one operation. There's no need to invent anything new. Everything was invented 100 years ago, but for aviation. So this kind of mechanism is possible for the deoccupation of Crimea specifically. Iran is still mainly a land-based country, and besides, it doesn't share a border with Israel. That's why there was no ground operation, but in principle it wasn't needed. We have the same situation, but for us it's much simpler. Russia will have to run away from us. Greater Crimea, I repeat once again, is an operational and geographical cauldron. They will have to flee there or simply perish. Everything will depend on the amount of strike assets available. Today we struck at Belbek and Kacha. These are Western airfields. The Russians have 5 such airfields that they use in Crimea. 5. 2 of them have already been hit more than once. Why exactly these airfield sites? Russia does not use them to deploy surface-to-air missile systems or radar units of the radio-technical troops. In other words, the eyes of Russian air defense begin. Roughly speaking, the first eye is Kacha. The last eye is the Kerch Bridge, meaning they are stretched out along this line. That's basically how it is. That's why there are strikes on Kacha, on Belbek, and on the adjacent airfields. This is the beginning of achieving air superiority, which will now be carried out by our special services, special operations forces, and unmanned systems forces. In other words, the defense forces near Crimea. When the actual air attack on Crimea happens, it will have to involve missiles. That is, missiles with sufficient range. Our Neptune works very well. It's not just long range. Yes, Neptune has a range of 280 kilometers. It reaches at least to the middle of Crimea, depending on the launch point, in fact, almost as far as Kerch. This is the basic Neptune, as it's called, of which we have a sufficient number in our coastal missile systems. This is our missile, which has been in service and carrying out combat missions for several years now, since 2018. The long-range Neptune can potentially go even farther, up to 1,000 kilometers towards Kamchatka. That's if that direction is chosen for a strike. And then there's the aviation component. We already have a 2nd brigade receiving F-16S. 2 brigades of F-16S are enough to carry out a military operation, an air operation that is using aerial strike assets, missile and bomb strikes without ground or naval operations. So we'll wait, meaning as the planes arrive, as they come in together with the aircraft, since it's still a platform, you need a sufficient amount of weaponry to carry out this kind of attack. Because as soon as we're ready, the main thing is that the Russians are ready. I'll say it again: crawl, breaststroke, doggy paddle.
Roman Lvovich. Well, for some reason, Sky News wrote that before winter, Ukraine might launch a large-scale attack on Crimea. This could be a quote like a naval landing by the Ukrainian armed forces or a massive attack on the Kerch Bridge. What do you think?
Well, I would argue about the naval part, because a naval landing is realistically possible in 3 locations in order to accomplish a specific task based on the capabilities we have. That's not Crimea, that's the Kerch, that's the Kinburn Spit, the Tendrov Spit, that's Skadovsk, the port of Skadovsk. But all of this is still the coastline of southern Ukraine on the Black Sea. In other words, it's the mainland coast, basically the left bank of the Dnipro. Basically, in an amphibious landing, the objective of any landing force, not just amphibious, but also airborne or ground landings, is to seize, that is, to make a rapid advance by various means, capture and hold a certain bridgehead until the main forces arrive. As for Crimea, if you try to land an amphibious assault there, that's just reckless, because no one is actually going to do that. Ground forces definitely won't be able to approach, since it would still take another 6 months to a year of working on Crimea with airstrikes. But for example, the Kinburn Spit, Tendrov Spit, and Skadovsk, this is a port, by the way, just 50 kilometers from Crimea. So let's say to carry out a combat mission of an amphibious landing, for instance, in the port of Skadovsk and hold it until the main forces arrive, which, for example, could cross the Dnipro from Kherson at Neoleshki, basically along a straight road. There's a direct road through Hola Pristan that leads to Skadovsk. They could cut off this triangle almost along the left bank of the Dnipro, and it would be possible to hold it. So in this kind of scenario, yes, it's a direction toward Crimea, but it's not actually Crimea itself. That's why when it comes to an amphibious landing, our partners, the journalists, were a bit hasty, to put it mildly. As for the Kerch Bridge, that's where the liberation needs to begin. Why the Kerch Bridge? Because it's exactly that logistical chain through which 30% of military munitions and equipment pass via Crimea, specifically to the Kherson-Zaporizhzhia front. Obviously, that's the first thing we need to take out. It's difficult to do. Why? Because there's a very complex, layered defense system there. Almost all our missiles and all our efforts are counted. It needs to be taken down with ballistic missiles. There needs to be enough Hrom missiles, several dozen, whether it's Hrom 1 or Hrom 2, it doesn't matter, depending on the range, 300 kilometers. In principle, that's possible. Only this way can we break through and push back the Russian defenses, specifically over Moscow, over the Kerch Bridge.
Roman Igorovich, when we talk about the military airfields of Kacha and Belbek, there is currently enemy tactical aviation stationed there. In what numbers? Because you and I don't know, we've practically discussed strikes on Kacha and Belbek together twice already. This is something that happens regularly.
These two airfields are used as forward operating bases. They host both tactical aviation and the main naval aviation of the Russian Federation. There is also a constant presence of army aviation helicopters, which are used to counter our drones over water and in the air. These helicopters can operate up to an altitude of 1 kilometer, by the way, and this is actually one of the main, if not the only, means the Russian Federation uses to target our drones, including aerial drones. They simply have a lot of helicopters covering the entire range of their helicopter fleet, which is army aviation. And so at these forward operating bases like Belbek or especially Kacha, they are stationed there with reloading and refueling points. It's a whole process. They're not the main bases, but as forward operating airfields, they fulfill their role.
Roman Igorevich, now regarding the strikes on these oil processing plants and other facilities, we attacked the Azot plant in Perm, Ork Nefti, Ork Sintos in the Orenburg region. What can you say about that?
Well, now we definitively know where these Russian orks truly come from. Ork, yes, indeed, from that very place. Our highly skilled specialists have clearly highlighted it. That's precisely where the primary ork lairs are located, roughly speaking, of course. But in reality, and this is important, we've thoroughly talked about this particular matter before, and in principle, our attentive listeners should be fully prepared for this significant development. The next stage in destroying the Russian economy is through the destruction of Russia's chemical industry. The oil and gas sector is one thing, but practically all of Russian chemistry, especially the part that mainly uses gas, is tied to the oil and gas sector. That's why they're now targeting chemical production, for example, and even our drones are flying 1,500 kilometers to reach these targets. The main goal, first of all, is to try to completely destroy these plants, if possible. Take the plant that was hit, the Perm plant. In addition to producing ammonia and so on, it also produced ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is used to make explosives and in large quantities at that. For us, it's very important to take the chemical industry out of the equation for this task, to prevent Russian, let's say, powder plants from producing explosives. So ammonium nitrate, among other things, also explodes very well. If anyone remembers, in Lebanon, in Beirut, a few years ago, there was an explosion of Russian ammonium nitrate. By the way, a Russian ship had docked there at the time. It was either standing there or unloading, and then suddenly it exploded, as they say. This kind of sudden explosion can be organized at any chemical plant that produces ammonium nitrate. So the plant in Perm used to produce it. And as for the Omsk plant, you could say it's mainly an oil refinery, primarily gasoline, diesel, and ammonia producers in Russia. For us, the Orsk plant is very important. And then if you go further east, about 3,000 kilometers away, there's the Omsk plant, the oil refinery. So that's Orsk. From there come the Orsk people. That's Orsk. And further on below Kazakhstan, yes, that's Omsk. So in Omsk, there is an oil refinery, the largest in Russia, processing 21 million tons per year. That means it's serious money, and it's essential to reach it and stop this oil processing. Yes, they do process some Kazakh oil there, but still it brings in money, so it's necessary to reach it as well. Well, since they've already reached Orsk, I think they'll get to Omsk too.
Roman Igorevich, according to dry statistics, analysts write that more than 40% of Russian oil refining capacity has already been put out of operation at refineries, and losses are estimated at over 100 billion. But when I talk to economists, they look at me and say, Putin doesn't care. The population can stand in line for gasoline. The queues can be enormous. There can be a massive fuel and energy crisis. They'll survive it. This won't affect Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine in any way. Roman Igorevich, I'd like to discuss this with you.
Well, putting pressure on Russian civil society definitely won't have any effect, and Putin really doesn't care. But our goal isn't to put pressure on Russian society. That's, as we've discussed many times, just a side effect. As they say, a side effect of what? The main part of the fuel, which is still produced at other plants, goes to the army. To put it simply, if a tank operator and a tractor driver are competing for diesel, the tank operator will win. Guess why? Because the tank has a gun and the tractor driver at best has some change in his pocket. So naturally, the tractor drivers are left without fuel while the tank operators complete their missions. Putin knows this perfectly well, and in fact, he doesn't pay any attention to it. Neither does the entire Russian military establishment. They absolutely don't care what Russian civilians will use to get around. That's just a side effect. Turning the gas station into a parking lot, a car impound lot, meaning all civilian cars will be immobilized. but this won't affect the military at all. To really impact the army's fuel supply, you need to destroy not just 40%, but the entire oil refining industry in Russia, plus cut off the flow of foreign currency. That's why we keep hitting the chemical industry, and next, like we've discussed before, expect more strikes on the chemical sector. Here they are. Let's make a prediction. The next strikes will be on metallurgy and Russia's energy sector, because the next stage is the destruction of metallurgy, which brings a significant amount of money to the Russian treasury. And of course, the energy sector, which powers the Russian Federation's military industry. There will definitely be strikes, 100%. That's the third stage. And to prevent the Russian army from getting fuel, you have to take down the entire oil and gas sector, plus cut off the natural flow of currency, including petrodollars, so they can't buy, as they're already starting to do, imported diesel and gasoline, so-called liquid diesel from abroad, trying to buy refined products from India, for example, made from someone else's oil to bring it back. So to stop the Russian army, you have to completely wipe out the Russian economy so they can't even afford to buy that Indian gasoline. After that, as we've already said, they'll switch to donkeys, which are braying now but don't want to go to war. The donkeys are here, but the little donkeys are gone. By donkeys, I mean Russians, these federists, but the little donkeys are all gone. Now a donkey costs more than a motorcycle. That's why Russian bloggers and public pages are flooded with offers to buy motorcycles for Russian soldiers. That's about what it costs. A bottle of water and a motorcycle, especially in Donbass, where there's no water at all, and who knows what's in those bottles. So that's the process. And to stop it completely, to stop the Russian army, you have to cut off these two flows, fuel production and currency. Without stopping the flow of currency, it will be very hard to stop the army.
Dear audience, please like this video and support our content with Roman Begolovich. Every like from you is priceless. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Let us know your location. Roman Begolovich, look. President Zelensky, I think it was the day before yesterday, said that until now we have attacked Russia exclusively with Ukrainian-made weapons, Ukrainian arms. But now the situation might change, Zelensky said. There are two pieces of news here. First, the US is providing Ukraine with intelligence for missile strikes deep inside Russia, meaning refineries, pipelines, power plants, and other facilities, including those in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is the first time that the Trump administration will be helping Ukraine carry out strikes using long-range missiles against targets deep within Russian territory. And secondly, there is currently consideration being given to the possibility of supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles. Roman Begolovich, how would you comment on this?
We know perfectly well where the Russian power plants, pumping stations, and pipelines are located. They all date back to the Soviet Union. It's very important for us to have the real-time locations of Russian air defense systems. That's something the Russians can share with us so that our drones can reach their targets. A drone is flying, let's put it simply. How long did it take the drone to reach Orsk? It's almost 1,500, more than 1,500 kilometers at a speed of 150 kilometers per hour, 10 hours. So in those 10 hours, it could be shot down 300 times, and it needs to have a flight route that avoids all the strike zones, all the control zones of Russian air defenses, which in fact are not that many anymore if the drone has already passed through the frontline air defense. But you need to know exactly, specifically, which air defense system is there and at what altitude it can engage targets. The radar beam, how to bypass it, at what speeds, at what altitudes to fly under the beam, meaning below the radio horizon. It's a whole process. And without intelligence data of this level, and the Americans see all of this, they have everything from radio reconnaissance to satellite monitoring. They can see perfectly well where each Russian station is turned on, how far its range is, and so on and so forth. And this data gives us the opportunity, even with our own weapons, to get through and complete the combat mission. Well, we've already talked about the OS, we've talked about Perm, so we've reached them. Now, a question about missiles. Well, I don't believe they'll give us Tomahawks. I don't believe it for one simple reason. If they were ready to give us Tomahawks, they would have already given us JASSMs for the F-16s we have, and they would have already given us Atacames for the HIMARS we have. So it's more just talk, really. Technically, it's possible. It's not that it's impossible, yeah. At this point, it's really a sea-launched missile. But a few years ago, a program was launched to restore ground launches, the so-called mobile ones. A sufficient number of launchers have already been created, Typhoon, or Typhoon, as they're also called, depending on the translation. Typhoon. These launches make it possible to fire, that is, to launch a Tomahawk missile from them. It's the same, basically, it's the same launch tube as the Mark 41 naval launcher. They just took it off and mounted it on a vehicle chassis, and from there, it can carry out a combat mission. But let me repeat myself. Why don't I believe it at this stage? Why? Because we've already been promised JASSM. We already have a second F-16 brigade, but not a single JASSM has arrived. By the way, cruise missiles have been given even less. This issue could have been resolved, but they're afraid. So if they're afraid to give us JASSM, do you really think they'll give us Tomahawks? But something like, say, the Barracuda level, well, that's not quite the same. You could call it a drone missile, and you say it's not a Barracuda. Yes, I'm talking about the Barracuda. So the Tomahawk is still a cruise missile, medium range, and its range is about 2,000 kilometers, give or take 500, depending on the type. And the Barracuda has a range of 500 kilometers, but nevertheless, it can carry 500. A 500 kilogram warhead. So basically, you could say it's a short range missile, about 500 kilometers. The Barracuda is roughly the same as the Tomahawk, only the Tomahawk cost millions of euros, while the Barracuda is several hundred thousand. It's simpler, and yes, it can be produced easily in large quantities, like our Pollyanna systems, for example, or the same Flamingo systems. We only hear about them in teaser videos, but in reality, let's say the Barracuda is already entering production now, and in half a year we could have it. But we won't be getting it tomorrow. It's only just starting to go into production. We'll probably get the ERAMs faster. So there is a missile that they've basically already started producing for us, and we can get those sooner. Because we're waiting, of course, for the weapons we've ordered, but it's much simpler. I've already explained this in simple terms, to just give us what we already have available. The launchers. We have HIMARS, about 50 of them, and ATACMS, please. A 300-kilometer range missile could already be in use. We have F-16S, already several squadrons that are carrying out combat missions, but what level of combat missions are they? They're chasing flies with fly swatters. In other words, using cannons, roughly speaking, against Shaheds or Gerans. So if they were given the opportunity, at least 100 JASSMs to strike at range, 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilometers, the same 500 kilogram warhead, and Moscow would be gone. They talk about a blackout. Imagine what a blackout in Moscow would be like. A blackout in Kyiv? Nothing terrible. How was it in Kyiv? Why was it nothing terrible? First of all, the population density isn't the same anymore. Some people have left. Secondly, we've already gotten used to it. We're prepared now. We know how to handle these issues, how to ensure vital services. And Kyiv, after all, has several times fewer people than Moscow. Just imagine, several tens of millions. Nobody even knows how many mouths there are in Moscow. Now, just imagine how many behinds there are in Moscow, and if they all go to the bathroom at the same time in a single day, but there's no water, there won't be any electricity either. The aroma there, let's put it mildly, will be of Russian spirit, and it will seriously spread within a radius of about 1,500 kilometers. It'll reach us. Well, it'll definitely reach as far as the Urals. In other words, it would just be a humanitarian catastrophe, and a really serious one at that. By the way, one way to kill off all the combat mosquitoes is that they just die from this Russian spirit. There will be a problem there, and such a possibility exists. If we were given those JASSMs, even just 100 of them, that kind of Russian spirit would reach all the way to the Urals.
Roman Grigorievich, when Zelensky says that previously we only used Ukrainian long-range strike systems, but now that's no longer the case, I'm curious, what is he talking about? What long-range missiles is he referring to? Is it European? What is President Zelensky talking about? So what could reach deep into Russian territory that isn't Ukrainian?
Well, what he's talking about is a question that millions of people have been asking for years, at least Ukrainians. So it's very hard for me to decipher, so to speak. But realistically, from what we might have at this stage, I've basically already mentioned it. We have a platform. So what can fly quickly? ATACMS can, the ones that have already been used, 300 kilometers. Well, what is 300 kilometers? Look, let me explain. A 300-kilometer ATACMS can reach Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh, Belgorod, and Rostov. That's 5 regional cities along the border, meaning cross-border cities. And that's not even mentioning Crimea or other Russian cities. So that's just what the ATACMS can reach. If they get the PRSM, by the way, the Americans are now switching to the PRSM. Then for the same, the HIMARS launcher, by the way, can fire 2 missiles, not just one. 2 Perm missiles per launch. The Perm has a range of 500 kilometers, which means it can reach up to 100 kilometers from Moscow. So creating a blackout in Moscow is actually very simple. With about 100 PRSMs, there would definitely be a blackout. And that's not even mentioning the possibility of using JASSMs, which could be dropped from F-16s. So that's what could potentially happen. That would certainly help us a lot, not to mention the Scalps, Storm Shadows, or, for example, the Taurus missiles. There's a lot that could be said about the Taurus missiles. The issue now is that, well, none of our aircraft can carry the Taurus yet, and the F-16 can't carry them either. The Gripen can carry them. So it's possible that if we get Gripens, even just a pair of planes, though usually a flight consists of 4, then we could also get Taurus missiles. That's also a 500-kilometer range, which means it can reach Moscow as well. Because we keep waiting, and maybe later we'll understand what our great leaders are talking about.
As you always say about the Moscow bathhouse, hello? Roman Igorovich, let's talk about drones over the territory of the European Union and NATO countries. So for the first time, 15 drones were detected at night in Belgium over a military base. Airports were shut down. Then drones appeared in Munich. Everyone was shocked. Civil aviation, airports temporarily suspended their operations. The plan was covered. Then at Valdai, Putin is asked, well, as they say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, how long are you going to keep launching drones? He says, there will be many of them, but you understand, it's not us, it's just some guys messing around over there. And in this way, essentially, Putin announced that a huge number of drones would be roaming the territories of the North Atlantic Alliance countries. Roman Lvovich, what does this indicate from a military perspective?
Well, for example, on the coast, there is probably more of an economic pressure. For instance, why did they go there? The main Nabulina reserves are kept there. The securities that she placed there, about 200 billion euros. We're talking specifically about Nabulina here. By the way, is she Tatar or Ukrainian? Pure-blooded, I mean, that's one thing. So that's probably one of the reasons why they're flying over Belgium, a purely military reason. There's a base in Belgium where the American nuclear stockpile is located. Among NATO countries, there are several NATO countries that have their own nuclear weapons. Those are France, Britain, and the United States. And American nuclear weapons, about 150 nuclear warheads, are also stationed in 5 other countries. In Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. And so naturally, there's a base in Belgium. And that's why the Russians, of course, will now try at the very least to find some way to approach these bases as well. The flights of these drones are not so harmless. They're not so harmless. This isn't a provocation. This is already a combat mission, the execution of a combat task. What do the drones do? They create what's called a digital map of the area, approaching certain targets and starting to photograph them, converting the images into digital form, which can then be uploaded into missiles, into the guidance system, into the missile's onboard memory. Who has heard of onboard memory? Well, that's exactly what these photographs are, the ones taken at first. Using those same drones are then uploaded, and the missile on the terminal phase of its trajectory, when it approaches the target, and electronic warfare systems try, for example, to disrupt it by cutting off its control and satellite connection. Well, at that point, it no longer needs a satellite connection if it has machine vision. In other words, it's a bunch of photographs that simply guide it to the target. But these photos need to be taken. They need to be taken from the air, from certain angles. So what are these drones doing? And honestly, I don't understand, why aren't they being shot down? This is preparation for serious strikes, for specific attacks, using the means of destruction that the Russians have. But if we have them, like Neptune, just so you know, this information is actually publicly available. And it also locks onto the target using exactly this kind of machine vision. Why is it that electronic warfare systems practically don't affect it? Well done, KB Luch, right away, even before. Why, for example, fight against electronic warfare? For what purpose? If you can just disconnect from the satellite and carry out the combat mission in exactly this way. It's simply a different approach, different frequencies, wavelengths being used, a different set of these digital images, but nevertheless, that's basically the principle. That's why Europeans shoot down everything that buzzes, especially over military facilities. Otherwise, something will buzz by later that you really won't like.
Friends, please like this video and write in the comments if the kitty has sent support to our tandem. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss key military and political topics. Roman Grigorievich is our military analyst, sometimes a psychologist, sometimes a psychiatrist when he evaluates the actions of the Russians and Putin, but we always provide clear analysis. the well-known military analyst Roman Svetlan. Roman Egorovich, thank you very much. And as usual, see you again on Monday.
Goodbye.